We're here in partnership with the local government commission. Today for our webinar, we'll be having Susan Shaheen, a adjunct professor over at UC Berkeley, who will be presenting the first session. The second presentation will be by Ron West over at Cambridge Systematics, and then we'll take questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So again, thank you for joining us today. This webinar will be recorded, so that way a copy of it will be available afterwards. Susan, after you.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Adam, and happy to be with everyone this morning. I will be presenting along with Adam Cohen today on shared mobility and micromobility today. So nobody, I think, is unfamiliar with the notion of disruption, and a lot of us have been talking quite a bit about that in the last 5 years, particularly in transportation. But disruption is not new. And in fact, these photographs give us a representation of disruption that occurred in the streets of New York City when we went from a more horse and carriage based model to one that favored the auto in just the span of 13 years. So this has happened before. And so we have many models from the past to look at for company and companionship. And the same is true for scooters. They are not new to transportation at all. And in fact, you can find similar old school photos like this showing the use of even electric scooters in the past. Okay. I seem to be having some trouble advancing the screen. There we go. Okay. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term shared mobility, basically it's this concept of a whole range of modes. They can be vehicles, bicycles, or other forms of mobility like a scooter that allows people to have access to them on a short-term basis, as opposed to going all in with a fixed ownership model. These concepts are not new. We've been studying them for over 2 decades at UC Berkeley, but they go even beyond 20 years of research. We find incidents of shared mobility dating back to the World War II era with car sharing, and also that same era for the concept of carpooling. This is a shared mobility ecosystem diagram. We put this together with the US Department of Transportation some years ago. And this particular ecosystem shows core and incumbent services on the left in the orange, ranging from taxis all the way to car rental. And on the far right, we see the innovative services that are infused with information technology, electronic wireless communication networks. And they range from bike sharing to scooter sharing to transportation network companies or ride sourcing to high-tech shuttles and some of the bread and butter forms of car sharing that really got the shared mobility space started. And in the intersection of the two circles, you see carpooling, vanpooling, casual carpooling. And the reason they're in the center is that many of these modes, which have been with us for a long time, are now also having IT types of approaches applied to them. So why should we care about shared mobility? Why are we here today? Well, there's a lot of people who hypothesize that shared mobility could potentially draw people away from the car paradigm, the single occupant vehicle paradigm. And that if we could do that, this would ultimately lead to environmental, social, and financial implications. Now, what a lot of the research is suggesting is that each mode in each context in which they're deployed, land use and built environment and different user groups, have different results. So that shared mobility in and of itself is not necessarily socially and environmentally beneficial, but its application and its mode, and that each one of these can be different based on where it's applied. And across the state of California, right, we have many different use cases, many different land use and built environments. So really understanding each of these shared modes, how they interface with one another, how they interface with public transit and the private auto and other incumbent modes is really important. And that's why we're putting on this webinar together today, is to really look at the importance of this understanding and the role ultimately of models in helping to get us there. So real-time information is going to be essential, not just to understanding what the impacts are based on their spatial and temporal dimensions, which are usually the dimensions that are used to measure congestion, for example, but the real-time information is critical to the user. So part of shared mobility is to also create more of a customer-driven experience that allows them to have more choices available to them and to commodify their transportation decisions based on better information, more reliable information. Smartphones are often used for that, and we've seen applications of them being used in carpooling, car sharing, transportation network companies, or ride sourcing, but we're also hearing a lot about multimodal planners and what that could lead to. Common terms that we're starting to hear about relative to some of those platforms are mobility as a service and mobility on demand. This particular figure illustrates the concept of mobility on demand. And mobility on demand is a bit different than mobility as a service. And mobility on demand goes further than mobility as a service, at least as how it's currently defined in Europe, by really saying that this is about an entire ecosystem of on-demand choices. And that's not just limited to the suite of services that we see on the left that I've just described, the shared mobility services, but it also has to do with payment systems, incentivization. It has to do with how people purchase goods, how people are making decisions about trip making, because now they may not have to go to their local shops. Now they might be able to accomplish some of those trips by using courier network type services or Amazon Prime type services. So how can we ultimately, through a mobility on demand service, ensure that people can get from point A to point B, either physically themselves or via an on-demand marketplace, but also how can we better match the supply and demand and match up those two factors based on things like congestion, social and environmental goals like equity and climate change. How can we use incentives? How can we use access to the rights of way, including curb space and parking? How can we use all of these components of the system to better manage supply and demand? And that's what mobility on demand is really about. It is less focused on ultimately getting to this integrated platform, although that's an end state of it. It is much more focused on balancing the supply and demand. Okay, mobility as a service has tended to focus on the culmination of an integrated mobility platform for mobility services to move an individual from point A to point B. This next figure also illustrates the differences between sort of that subscription-driven mobility aggregation of a platform on the mobility as a service spectrum to the mobility on demand perspective to the left, which is more about systems management and trying to figure out how to commodify both passenger and goods movement in a way that does lead to socially beneficial outcomes. You can see they both have commonality in that they're really talking about seamless routing, booking, payment, and multimodal integration as their backbone. So I think I'm going to turn the presentation over to Adam so he can walk you through a number of the slides as well. So Adam, I'm happy to drive this for you as you get a moment to co-present. Adam? Are you available to present on micromobility, or would
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There we go. So this slide here just shows kind of the growing number of kind of micromobility services. And so, you know, micromobility is really kind of the sharing of a bicycle, a scooter, or other mode. And they're really for kind of last mile transportation here. So you can see here, you've got the standing electric scooters on the upper left. We've got kind of a moped style scooter on the lower left. In the middle, both station-based and dockless bike sharing. And then on the right side, a growing number of electric modes. So this here, you can see kind of an electric unicycle as well as a Segway. Next slide. So sharing and electrification are really kind of reshaping personal mobility and kind of enabling both kind of shared as well as privately owned micromobility. Electric motors are being added to equipment such as bicycles and scooters, as well as moped-style scooters, skateboards and unicycles. And they're changing the marketplace, and it's creating some challenges for local governments in terms of understanding the nature of these services, where they should be permitted to operate both while in motion as well as parked. And so this is a great example here from Atlanta, where you can see somebody has decided to take an electric scooter that was really kind of designed for a more urban environment, and they've taken it on the freeway during rush hour. Next slide. So there are a couple different operational models for shared micromobility. These include station-based models where a bicycle or a scooter is checked out from a station and then can be returned to the same station or to another location. So this here in the upper right is an example of kind of a solar-powered station-based bike sharing system. It can also be dockless or stationless, where bicycles and scooters may be picked up within a defined area and then parked along a sidewalk or at a rack, and they can either be locked or unlocked. So that an example of this is in the lower right. And then there's also what's known as kind of flexible or hybrid systems that have the options of either being picked up or dropped off from a station or in a stationless capacity. And sometimes an operator may offer incentives to locate equipment at a particular location or to return it back to a station, say to charge, for example. Next slide. So just a little example here in terms of by the numbers. As of May 2018, the U.S. had 261 bike-sharing operators with more than 48,000 bicycles. NACTO estimates that 44% of all of the bike-sharing bikes in 2017 were dockless, and that they accounted for about 4% of the bike-sharing trips. In addition to that, as of 2017, they estimate that 35 million trips were completed using bike sharing in the U.S. And if we look at scooter sharing, as of September of last year, you'll see that Lime had 11.5 million rides on its bikes and scooters combined. Bird had over 10 million rides. And that Spin, as of that time, were operating in 18 cities. In addition to that, we estimate that there were 65,000 scooters operating nationally as of fall of last year. Next slide. So there's a couple common concerns that can arise through the use of micromobility. Some of the concerns that are confronting local governments is fear of what's known as bicycle or scooter pileups. An example of this is, I believe it's photos from China up in the upper right here. Damage and theft and vandalism to the equipment, safety considerations and helmet use, how to manage the curb space and sidewalk. Should the equipment be operated on the sidewalk, and if so, where and where do they park the equipment? Should there be locking mechanisms, or should equipment be required to be locked to street furniture? How are issues such as system imbalance addressed? And then what other types of legal and equity issues can arise. Next slide. So a number of cities have implemented permit processes for dockless micromobility services. And a few examples just show from Seattle here on the right, they've established what they know as a sidewalk zone with particular guidance in terms of where to park micromobility services. This is really key to make sure that the services aren't blocking pedestrian access, and in particular, ADA access for people in a wheelchair. On the lower right is an example of a corral. This is from Seattle, but this method has also been applied in Santa Monica as well as other cities. Other policy areas that are important to consider in terms of including equipment standards, liability, and indemnification of liability, plans for deployment and rebalancing, parking guidelines, enforcement, what to do if the equipment is parked improperly, and what types of fees, if any, should be charged for access to the public rights of way. Next slide. So some emerging issues that we see are, how do we understand and leverage the impacts of these innovative transportation technologies? How do we plan and adapt the public rights of way, both street and curb space management? How do we incorporate shared mobility into planning and modeling? This is something that Ron is going to be talking about with next. And then how do we prepare for an automated vehicle future? Next slide. So with that being said, I'd like to kind of conclude the presentation. I just want to thank, the many sponsors of our work, including Caltrans, the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Minetta Transportation Institute, 11th Hour, Smart Cities Lab, and ICCT. Our contact information is here. We'd be glad to follow up with anybody who has any questions. We'll go to Ron next, and then we'll take some questions at the conclusion of Ron's presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I'll take over the presentation now, and I hope folks can screen. Can everybody hear me, and can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great, great, good. Technology works right. Okay, so Susan and Adam did a nice job of talking through the different kinds of elements that comprise what we think of shared mobility. In terms of the being able to model these, this is something we're clearly playing some catch up on. And I will say from my own personal experience, I recently did some forecasting for the California Transportation Plan, CTP 2050, and we looked at a number of potential impacts due to connected and autonomous vehicles. And I have to say, when we talk about shared mobility, I find it hard to disassociate myself from thinking about the connected and automated vehicle space and what that's going to mean to our transportation system, of which the shared mobility is clearly an important component of it. But what we did was we looked at a number of factors that are in the connected and automated vehicle space. We looked at things like roadway capacity changes, the idea of more people traveling. For example, there's a number of mobility impaired people who just cannot travel for various reasons, maybe due to age or whatever health issues they may have. These people may be able to travel in the future. We may see a reduced demand for parking, but on the other hand, that might translate into more travel on city and state highways because people might choose to have an automated vehicle drive around the block a whole bunch of times or travel into congested areas that they might not otherwise go to, because you have a more comfortable ride and you could be doing productive or entertaining activities while you're traveling, which is certainly a change. And I think it's a challenge for us in the travel modeling world, where travel has always been a disk utility. And in other words, people, unless it's like the Sunday afternoon drive or you're on vacation somewhere beautiful and the whole point is to take a drive through a nice area, relaxing drive, for the most part, we're traveling merely to fulfill activities. And there's a negative, right? We don't travel to Los Angeles to go buy a gallon of milk because that would be an enormous, enormously ridiculous trip, way too long. So the idea that you could be productive or entertained while you're traveling could turn the whole notion of travel on its ears, and people may travel to do interesting things or go to interesting places that they might not otherwise go to. However, we did look at more of a shared mobility element, but in terms of these analyses, most of the work that we did looked at increased vehicle miles of travel, increased amounts of travel, with all the obvious negative side effects in terms of delay and air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, for example, that come along with that. I would say from a modeling standpoint, there is a lot of interest these days in vehicle choice and fuel choice models, which I think would fit neatly into the shared mobility concept. And I have to say, when I think of vehicles, I tend to think more of passenger vehicles and maybe less about things like bicycles and scooters, though those are clearly growing in importance as well. But I want to cover this, and gosh, with only 20 minutes or so, it's hard to dig too deeply into the whole concept of shared mobility. But I want to look at it from three main points of view from the modeling standpoint, and looking at shared mobility as a main travel mode for personal travel. I'm looking at commercial travel, and Susan, I believe, had mentioned courier type services, the Amazon driver. It could be the Uber driver. It could be a various number of things, including automated trucks as well. And in addition, on the commercial travel, you have a combination. You now have people who make a combination of personal and commercial travel, which makes us modelers kind of crazy because our surveys and data don't necessarily lend itself to that kind of mixed type of travel. And then another important mode, I think a very significant mode for shared mobility, is as an access mode to or from transit. It could be to or from other major activity centers such as airports and train stations like high-speed rail, for example. In terms of the main travel mode, I did mention again that Caltrans, for Caltrans, Cambridge Systematics did some analysis for some preliminary CTP 2050 forecasts. Some similar work has been undertaken for the Colorado DOT, looking at connected autonomous vehicles. In both cases, and I think in many other states, and I know in many NPOs, there's definitely an intention to add connected and autonomous vehicles and TNCs to statewide models. I would say right now, the literature that I've seen and the analyses that I've seen is that NPOs and state agencies are beginning to include TNCs into their household travel surveys, their household activity surveys. I've just been reading about some work that SACOG has done, and I think it's pretty interesting. And they purposely included the Ubers and the Lyfts in their household travel survey. I've got a little bit of data on that. San Francisco has sort of famously conducted quite a bit of analysis of the impact of the TNCs on congestion throughout San Francisco. I will move on. In terms of the shared mobility, and again, I'm in the vehicle space right now. I think that it gets a bit complex, and this is where we need some direction from the policymakers, because if we look at the elements on the left, the ideas of less demand for parking, limited mobility travelers, more comfortable ride experiences, zero occupant vehicle trip. So this is deadheading, basically the shared mobility vehicles traveling, dropping off one traveler and then picking up the next traveler. combined effects, and as well as shared mobility types of elements are highly dependent on the level of automation for vehicles. I think it's not clear to me and to probably many people when automated vehicles and shared mobility as a service types of mobility options truly become available, right? So there's really a lot of questions out there. and I do apologize. I mean, in many ways, I think I end up raising more questions than I provide answers. But we do need to have modelable elements in terms of the connected and autonomous vehicles. And then for shared mobility, does it get added as a new mode, or does it, and even potentially as a series of new modes? And I've got a slide or two a little further on that'll explain this a little bit more. So do we consider people, for example, who take Uber pools or Lyft line, right, which you'll have 3 or 4 people in a vehicle? Do we count them as carpoolers, or do we call them, they're kind of technically called poolers, but do we include them with shared ride vehicles in the travel demand models, or do they become separate modes of travel unto themselves as well? So these are some of the questions in terms of the main mode. Turning over to commercial travel, automated trucks, truck platooning. I'm sure people have all read about the idea that you could potentially get a lot more truck throughput in certain corridors. I think this tends to be a bigger issue in Southern California, coming out of the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, along, for example, the 710 corridor, and then some other connecting corridors out into the Inland Empire and a lot of the logistics centers out there. And logistics and warehousing tends to be a much bigger part of the economy down in Southern California than in Northern California. But there is certainly a lot of interest in automated trucks and truck platooning and much greater truck throughput. I think an area that a lot of the models are missing information are from small trucks that are used for both personal and commercial purposes. So I'm talking about light duty trucks, but bigger than the personal vehicles that we might see in the cities. And then personal vehicles that are used for commercial purposes. So some of these categories are just missing from the models, or their models deal with them in a very sort of generic way and just factor up basic trip tables. And I do think that this is an area of research that really needs to occur, and we need to get data on these kinds of vehicles to understand the commercial space better than we've been able to until recently. And then the transit access egress modes. And this is an area where I think that the shared mobility idea is really, really significant. We just hired a young woman who just finished up her PhD at the University of Kentucky, and she was one of the lead researchers on the work in San Francisco on the Uber analysis. And she lives in Oakland, and our office is in downtown Oakland. She lives over near the Fruitvale BART station, and some days she will take the bus to work, and some days she will take BART to work. But today it was raining out, and she took an Uber pool. And I talked to her about it. And the Uber pool is very, very competitive on a price basis and a time basis, and certainly probably far superior on a convenience basis to taking the bus or having to schlep over to BART. And I think that this is causing an almost existential threat to local transit services. And I think the local transit service providers, the urban transit providers, are going to have to figure out a better way to compete with the Uber pools and the Lyft lines of the world. On the other hand, other operators, and I use a Bay Area example again, of Caltrain and BART may actually benefit greatly from these kinds of services, because if someone's commuting from, say, Walnut Creek or Concord, and they're going to, say, somewhere like Emeryville or Alameda, then an Uber type of service might be just a thing that gets them to their last mile. Now, there are various equity issues, and it's certainly a lot more expensive to take Uber potentially over from the BART station over to Emeryville or Alameda. In this case, the Uber pool may not work to that kind of that reverse kind of direction, but nonetheless, You know, these are some things that I think that can be incorporated into the model, that we could have potentially shared mobility as an access mode to transit. We certainly, I think we're seeing some of the MPOs begin to add, for example, TNC as an access mode to transit. So this is something I think we're going to increasingly see built into the models. I'll mention some shortcomings as well, and some things that we need to overcome to fully incorporate these into the models. Some of these new and emergent modes, how significant will they become over time? I think it's pretty fair to say that 10 years ago, I think it was pretty doubtful that many people were forecasting the ubiquity of the Uber and Lyft into our lives, and I think it's been kind of surprising to a lot of people, but yet here it is. And the question becomes on the forecasting: well, what will be the penetration of Uber and Lyft 10 years in the future, 20 years, 30 years, and then all sorts of other automated vehicle technologies come online as well. There's a fair amount of professional judgment that's required. Most of the work that I've seen on this space and the forecasting tends to use a lot of professional judgment, and I think that's fine, but it does point the need to be able to collect data in such a way that we can begin to incorporate that into our models. I'm certainly interested. Adam reeled off a bunch of really interesting statistics on some of the scooters and bike share data, and it may be possible to begin to incorporate those into the models in a more meaningful way. I would just, as a note, say in general, MPO models have not treated bike and walking with the degree of sophistication and analysis that we devote to transit and auto modes. Now, that's not universally true, and I don't mean to paint too broad a brush on that, but in general, the level of analysis that goes into the bike and walk tends to be a bit less, quite a bit less than on the motorized modes. Moving on, you know, how should we analyze these emergent modes? Again, I mentioned the one example: should we distinguish Uber pool users from regular old carpoolers? And then the big one, of course, is the data. I didn't really talk about the data too much, but in general, the TNC companies have been loath to freely share their data with public agencies. Now, in the case of San Francisco, the researchers were able to get a hold of some publicly available API data. I don't know if that data is still available, but SFCTA, for example, did make a formal request to Uber and Lyft to obtain their data so that they could build up their study from, you know, in a sort of a more cooperative fashion, and they were turned down. There's new state legislation that gives ARB some ability to regulate the TNCs. They have similarly requested statewide TNC data, and they've been turned down for that information as well. But you know, you wonder at some point that TNC data, I think, is going to open up, and we're going to get it in some manner, and then that's going to be enormously beneficial for helping to build up the models and include the TNC modes in the models, and including, of course, if we can get the TNC and break it out by the people who travel alone, like UberX versus Uber Pool, and be able to get that information. That will be highly useful. I would say one key issue, though, on the big data side is that we got a lot of information. We get a ton of information. It's like the proverbial, you know, hose of, full hose of water hose of data on who travels, when they travel, where they travel, how much they travel, but we don't know why people travel. And that tends to be really important to us in the modeling. We want to know why people are traveling so we can build up behavioral and predictive models of people's propensity to use different modes. The travel surveys are being expanded to include these kinds of information, and I'm hoping that over time, the household surveys may include some levels of commercial travel so that they could capture people who may drive for Amazon or Lyft using their own personal vehicles or company vehicles. I do, again, I'm going to throw out a question for the planners and policymakers is how should the mix of personal travel and vehicle automation combined with shared mobility be represented in the future for the models? And so here is just a very basic sort of 2x2 matrix of personally owned versus shared ride vehicles, and then driver driven and autonomous vehicles. And it's all grayed out in the middle because we don't know what that mix should ultimately look like. But this might ultimately become the basis for how we view the modes of travel in the shared ride space and in the CAV as well. And then some thoughts on the direction of modeling. Yeah, we're going to be including the emergent transportation modes. There's no question. I would say that the costs and difficulties of collecting traditional household diaries are changing how data is collected. I was looking at the SACOG household travel survey, and I think they did a wonderful job. They collected about 4,000 household travel surveys over, I think, a 2-week time period or a 10-day time period in 2018. Terrific data, 4,000 households. It ends up being a less than 1% sample for the region. Now, I'm not being critical. You take the 4,000 household travel surveys and you multiply it by an average cost of, I don't know exactly the amount, but let's just ballpark say $300 a survey. I mean, these are enormous investments in data, over $1 million for a region like SACOG, right? The prices just go up for other larger regions in terms of what they need to get a representative sample. That big data, I think, becomes more and more a useful way to think about how models will be constructed. The initial deployments are frankly going to be pretty, in terms of deployment in the modeling systems, are going to be pretty crude. It's going to be couched under the idea of sensitivity testing and post-processing, and I think that's quite appropriate. We're going to see very large modal constants, which is my sort of technical / sneaky way of saying that we don't really understand the factors of the shared mobility model. So we have large modal constants. The modal constants basically explain all the things we don't know in the models. So we generally like those constants to be as small as we reasonably can get them, and put more weight on various other modes related to time, cost, and other factors. We will be seeing more sophisticated traffic assignment methodologies. For example, Sandag, I believe, has deployed a dynamic traffic assignment. These are much, much better than traditional static traffic assignment, which I think will be increasingly important. And hopefully we'll find some methodologies for forecasting the shorter distance type of trips, like bicycle, walk, and scooter type trips in the future. I think that also, given the high degree of uncertainty on the forecasting, it's going to be important to, I think it's going to be really important to produce ranges of forecast, ranges of outcomes, rather than single point forecasts that we've traditionally done. And I think we're seeing this in the profession, and I think it's something that planners and decision makers are going to ultimately have to be more comfortable with, not just having a single point forecast, but a range of potential outcomes. I think that provides a much better level of information, and providing uncertainty along with perhaps midpoint forecasts, I think would do our profession a world of good. Before I check out, I'll show you some data that I have here very quickly, if I can. The National Household Travel Survey, for example, looked at taxi, limo, which included Uber and Lyft. They found that on a national basis, about 0.5% of the trips were this mode. I just looked at the SACOG Household Travel Survey. That survey showed about a 0.2% Uber Lyft penetration. Now, they specifically looked at Uber and Lyft and separated it out from the taxi mode. So 0.2% in SACOG. And then in San Francisco, for intra-San Francisco trips, about 20% of the trips, up to 20% of the trips are on Uber and Lyft. So there's a really wide range of market penetration at this point. And with that, I'll leave it there. I imagine there may be some questions, and be happy to try to follow up and answer your questions.
Great. Yes, well, we did receive some questions, and I think the first one I'll direct to you, Ron.
Okay.
If we've been studying shared mobility for decades, at what point will we have accumulated enough data or observed trends in enough cities to make recommendations? At what point does this data actually become useful?
Well, that's a great question. I would say that I don't know that we've been necessarily studying the data for decades yet. Some of these modes, for example, like Uber and Lyft, are really quite new. So we're really, I think, in the early stages of gathering the data. Now, if the idea of shared mobility were to include traditional carpooling, then yes, that data has been around for a long time. But I think that the shared mobility concepts that Adam and Susan discussed are substantially different from traditional carpooling. And I think that the methods that people travel, the way that they access the transportation system are fundamentally different than most of the traditional carpooling, with perhaps the exception of the casual carpooling that goes on in the Bay, in the Bay Area, East Bay. People will show up and they've done this for decades. They've shown up at bus stops in the morning. They will get together in a carpool to go over to the Bay Bridge into San Francisco. And then the afternoon, where there's not a toll in the reverse direction, those people will generally take BART or AC Transit or the ferries back home in the afternoon. But beyond that, I think this stuff is very new. So we're still trying to know the data better.
So this is Susan. I have been studying these modes for over 2 decades. And what I will say is that it's been a constant evolution and dynamic. And so while I think we have some good baseline understanding of a few of the older modes, say like round trip car sharing, particularly in urban areas, car sharing itself has evolved into peer-to-peer car sharing, moved into different land use built environments, and there's a lack of data and understanding about how they're being used, as Ron suggested. And we're seeing not quite new modes, but the evolution of these shared dockless systems at a much different scale than they were initially introduced. Dockless bikes have been around for a bit, but the scale in which we've seen them just between 2018 and 2019 is quite substantial and different. So I think we've got to continue to monitor this space and model this space because we don't entirely know where it's going.
Okay, well, I have another question. I think this is for Susan or Adam. Are traditional public transit agencies thinking about autonomous vehicles that are smaller and on demand to reduce costs and improve service?
Yeah, this is Susan. I definitely think a number of transit operators are looking at these shuttles. For example, you might be familiar with the Easy Mile shuttle. There's a number of these demonstrations occurring across the country right now. And I know quite a few transit operators are looking at these low-speed automated shuttles to fill gaps in the transit network, to provide the first mile, last mile connectivity that Ron suggested would be a big opportunity. So I think there's a lot of people thinking about it. But what I will say is that, in this world of impacts and modeling that I do a lot of work on and Ron does a lot of work on, what we aren't talking about is labor, workforce, economic issues, right? That these are these very critical socioeconomic issues that are going to interface with all this technology, not just the modeling side, right? So that's going to be a big question that transit operators are going to be asking is how much of that can we outsource? How much of that can we evolve towards automation in light of the forces around labor unions? And the other issue is, do people want to get into a vehicle that's not monitored by a human being? And we really don't know how comfortable people are with that notion. So there's a ton of research and unanswered questions, I think, is what Ron and I are telling you.
Okay, and I believe this next question is for Ron, but if not, please feel free to pitch it to Susan or Adam. We've had taxis for years, which essentially provide the same service as TNCs. From a travel behavior, utility, or choice modeling viewpoint, what aspects of TNCs make them more attractive than taxis?
You know, that's a great question. And I've spoken with other modelers, and they will, you know, have said to me, and I've even thought this myself in the past, well, TNCs are just a taxi mode, right? But they're a taxi mode that is more convenient because you can book it right on your phone. You don't have to like call some person and then the taxi shows up at some unknown time. You can track it on your cell phone. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you can do that with taxis these days. I tend to, you know, my own personal experience is that when I take taxis, it tends to be ad hoc. I'm at an airport, there's no TNCs around, I'll find the taxi stand and I'll use a taxi. But otherwise, I think it's the convenience and the ubiquity of the TNCs that become quite so significant. And I've recently become aware of how important the Uber pools are as well. And for a number of people, if you look at the San Francisco Muni ridership statistics, for example, their ridership has declined substantially. And this is the first time in the history of our modern society that transit ridership for major urban operators has not tracked the basic health of the economy. So in other words, when the economy does well, the sales taxes in California roll in, the operators are able to roll out more services, there's more people going to activities, there's more people going to jobs, transit ridership increases. The economy dips down, the sales taxes dry up, the services, they tend to you know, pull back some of the services and the ridership goes down. We've had a substantial economic upturn in California for the last, oh gosh, 9 or 10 years. And yet the ridership has gone steadily down. And the example that I had given of the a person that I work with today took an Uber pool over the bus or BART is, I think, highly illustrative of why the Ubers and the Lyfts are fundamentally different. You know, there's a personal experience element to it as well, which I don't need to probably get into that too deeply, but I think in general, the Uber ride might, you know, generally be nicer cars and more pleasant, less smelly vehicles than taxis have traditionally been. Again, I'm interjecting a certain amount of personal experience and just take that with a grain of salt. But there's a technology element that I don't know that we have that in our models, the convenience and the better knowledge of when the ride will be coming. You know, because you can do something else, right? If your Uber ride's not coming for the next 10 minutes, that's fine. You can go engage in something else. Taxi, previously, you call up for a taxi, you never know exactly when it's going to come. So you have to sort of be on guard. You have to be ready. You can't engage too deeply in other activities. Otherwise, you may miss your taxi ride.
This is Susan. I just wanted to interject that we published a paper in 2016 in Transport Policy called Just a Better Taxi, in which we did a match pair analysis of taxis and TNCs. And at that time, the taxi industry really hadn't started to deal with this notion of e-hail, right? An app that can be used to summon a vehicle and for payment. And so I would argue that the taxi industry has evolved quite a bit since we collected this data back in 2015. But what we found at that time in San Francisco was that what distinguished these two modes was that the TNCs had more consistent, reliable wait times than the taxis. In terms of origin destinations, we found very matchable pairs between the origins and the destinations in this particular study. There's been other research on taxis and TNCs that suggests that TNCs may not be venturing into all of the neighborhoods that we see TNCs going into. So there may be a more equitable, accessible transportation option going on. But then you also see counterfactual evidence that suggests that people may be racially biased and not picking up African-American sounding names, or women might be going on longer rides in TNCs. So I think I'd like to stick with the argument that I think the industries are both evolving, and they may ultimately converge to something that looks more similar. But in the original research that we did back in 2015, we did see a substantial difference, but it really had a lot to do with, I would say, service quality with respect to that wait time. That was where we saw a statistically significant difference.
Well, great. I have a question for Susan and Adam. What kinds of incentives, pressure, or legislation is necessary to make sure all these modes are electric and not gasoline?
Great question. So there has been some motion here in California that you may be familiar with. There's a new piece of legislation that CARB, the California Air Resources Board, is currently working on, called SB 1014, that specifically targets the category of TNCs and is applying an emission per passenger mile metric, wanting to collect baseline data for analyzing this as soon as 2020, and then implementing the policy to drive those emissions per passenger mile down. One mechanism for doing that is clearly electrification, and that can include hydrogen vehicles as well as battery electric vehicles. But there's other techniques that can be used. And in fact, this particular policy, 1014, talks about the TNCs getting credit for scooter trips and bike trips. We can look at the pooling option, as Ron has suggested. We can also look at the right sizing of vehicles beyond just electrification. And we can certainly look at more efficient routing of vehicles to reduce the deadheading of miles that you typically see with taxis and limos and TNCs. So I think that's something that's very interesting to look at, right? That coincides along with our advanced clean fuel policies here in California, or more specifically, the zero emission vehicle mandate.
Great. Well, I have a question now for Ron. Is there any indication from the data we do already have whether the absolute number of vehicles and on the road, that the absolute number of vehicles on the road have increased, therefore causing more traffic?
Yes, in a word, I suggest folks read the San Francisco TNC study. It's pretty eye-opening. The research there indicates that about 50% of the additional congestion in San Francisco is due to the TNC trips. And, you know, the problem, again, because I think that maybe the issue isn't necessarily that the TNCs are causing people to travel more. I think that the issue is that the TNCs are taking trips that would otherwise be made on transit, or people might otherwise have walked a longer distance. As an example, if you're south of Market and, you know, The Caltrain stops at 4th and Townsend, right? It's about a mile from the traditional downtown. People would walk or take the metro. The metro, maybe not the greatest option to take all the time because it could be crowded. It's a little bit out of the way and slow at times. So people would walk it, and I think increasingly people would say, "I'll pay a couple bucks and I'll jump on an Uber pool," and that's really helped increase traffic quite a bit.
Great. And then one more question for Susan Adam regarding the socioeconomic relationship. It appears, at least down here in the Sandag region, that there is an unfulfilled demand for more public transportation versus TNCs from lower income communities. Are the transit agencies thinking at all about expanding service in those areas and getting increased ridership?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I'm not particularly familiar with what the San Diego transit agencies are thinking at the moment, but I know that Sandag has made some pretty bold statements about drastically improving public transit so that it can outright compete with the private auto. And that would suggest from the MPO itself that they are thinking they need to raise a lot of money to improve the public transit system. And I think this gets at the fundamental issue of the day, right? Is that we've got a lot of entities on the road, and we've got a lot of cars with one person in them taking up a lot of space. And if we could more efficiently move people in that precious space, then we wouldn't have as many societal issues. But if we can't compete with the private car, people are going to choose other modes. And unfortunately, what that's done is it's limited the number of resources we have for public transportation. So I would say that there's some good news coming out of the leadership of Sandag that would suggest that they're looking at ways to really seriously improve the public transit backbone. And I would imagine be looking at ways to innovate services for lower income populations, providing gap filling services like late night transportation, and providing those first mile, last mile connections.
Okay. Well, it looks like we only have a minute left. I'm not certain if we can get to any more questions. I guess I'll hand it over to Adam and Susan if you want to wrap up.
So thank you, Kayla. Again, we just want to thank everybody who joined us for the webinar today. If you have questions you'd like to correspond with us afterwards, please feel free to do so. We will post the webinar and the slide deck on our Shared Mobility Resources page. We provided that link in the chat box, and we'll work with Kayla to send that out, as well as a copy of the webinar. Again, we want to thank everybody, and also, most importantly, thank Caltrans for funding this very important research. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.